Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most disturbing and quietly tragic truths in royal history. A time when kings married their nieces, cousins married cousins, and children were born twisted by the bloodlines meant to preserve power. It happened more often than you'd imagine. In palaces, in private chambers, behind embroidered veils. And for one royal mother, it led to the birth of a child so deformed, his existence was almost erased from history. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always quietly powerful to see how far these old, buried stories reach. If you find value in these slow, forgotten histories, feel free to subscribe. You're always welcome here. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. And let's begin. You're walking down a silent palace corridor. There's something muffled behind the door. And a queen is screaming. The story of Charles II of Spain begins not with a birth celebrated, but with a silent cry that echoed through the grand halls of the Alcazar of Madrid. Born into a dynasty that once ruled vast empires, his life would become a haunting testament to the dangers of obsession with purity of blood and power. His arrival was shrouded in anxiety. His mother, Mariana of Austria, and the royal physicians held their breath, hoping this child would be the miracle to save the Spanish throne from decline. Instead, he was born fragile, malformed, and marked by the unmistakable signs of generations of inbreeding. His face carried the infamous Habsburg jaw, a grotesque protrusion that would come to symbolize the dynasty's slow decay. But it was more than physical deformities that defined Charles. His body was weak and his mind clouded, a shadow of the vigor expected from a king. From his earliest days, Charles's existence was a delicate balancing act. He required constant care, yet his position demanded he appear regal and strong. The pressure was immense. The Spanish Empire, once dominant in Europe and the New World, was now faltering, and the hope rested solely on this fragile boy. But nature had other plans. His childhood was filled with doctors, priests, and advisors, all seeking ways to cure or conceal the deficiencies that plagued him. The royal court, once a place of celebration and power, became a theater of anxiety and fear. As Charles grew, his body failed him. His speech was slow, often unintelligible, his movements clumsy and weak. He suffered frequent seizures, and his health declined steadily, casting a shadow over the future of the empire. Yet, despite his frailty, Charles was crowned King of Spain at the tender age of 4 after the death of his father, Philip IV. The ceremony was grand, but the reality was starkly different. Real power slipped from the king's hands into those of regents and ministers who governed in his name. The young king became a figurehead, trapped in a role that he could barely fulfill. The court whispered of his disabilities behind closed doors, but to the public, the illusion of royal dignity was maintained. The king was seen in brief, carefully orchestrated appearances, while the true ruling was done in shadow. Charles's mental limitations made it impossible for him to understand the complex politics surrounding him. Yet he bore the heavy weight of the crown, carrying the silent burden of a lineage that was crumbling beneath him. The consequences of his genetic heritage were devastating. The repeated intermarriages within the Habsburg family, aimed at preserving power and bloodline purity, had instead concentrated harmful mutations. This tragic reality manifested not only in Charles's physical deformities but also in his reproductive incapacity. Despite 2 marriages, Charles II was unable to father children. This infertility meant the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was inevitable. Each passing year brought increased anxiety and desperation within the court. Foreign powers, aware of the fragile state of the Spanish monarchy, began to maneuver for advantage. The prospect of the throne passing to a foreign ruler loomed, threatening to ignite a continental conflict. Charles's personal life was marked by isolation and suffering. His body grew more frail as he aged, his health a constant source of worry for those around him. He was often confined to his chambers, tended by a small group of loyal servants who understood his needs despite his limited communication. The king's mind, though slow and confused at times, was not without awareness. He knew he was a source of shame and sorrow to his family and kingdom. This knowledge tormented him, deepening his psychological distress. Religious devotion became his refuge. Hours were spent in prayer before relics, seeking divine intervention for his ailments and the future of the dynasty. The king's obsession with faith reflected both his desperation and the spiritual climate of 17th century Spain. The court itself became a stage for surreal performances. Elaborate ceremonies continued despite the king's inability to participate fully. Foreign ambassadors reported bizarre scenes of a monarch who stared blankly through state dinners, drooled onto his food, and muttered incoherent sounds. Musicians played solemn pieces while the king sat silent, detached from the world around him. Political power shifted to councils and advisors who ruled behind the scenes, using Charles as a symbol rather than a leader. The decay of the monarchy mirrored the decline of Spain's global influence. Colonial holdings weakened, trade faltered, and military defeats piled up. Spain was a shadow of its former self, its greatness diminished by the genetic legacy embodied in its last Habsburg king. Throughout this decline, the human cost of the dynasty's obsession was painfully clear. Charles's life was marked by suffering not just from physical ailments, but from isolation and helplessness. His relationships were strained. His mother, Queen Mariana, oscillated between fierce protection and harsh expectations, while his wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, eventually withdrew from court life, overwhelmed by the tragic reality of her husband's condition. The king's few moments of joy came from simple pleasures, a pet's companionship, familiar routines, or the fleeting respite of music and court entertainments. But these were brief reprieves in a life dominated by pain and despair. As Charles entered his 30s, his condition deteriorated rapidly. His seizures became more frequent and violent, leaving him unconscious for long periods. He required assistance with the most basic tasks: eating, dressing, walking. The grotesque features that had marked his youth became more pronounced, and his emaciated frame struggled to survive. His mental state declined in parallel. Paranoia took hold. He feared poisoning and betrayal, scrutinizing his food and companions with suspicion. The once proud king had become a shadow, a prisoner of his own body and mind. Despite this, the court clung to the illusion of stability. The monarchy, while hollowed out, still commanded respect and loyalty, though beneath the surface, the empire was unraveling. Internationally, Charles's health was a matter of intense scrutiny and speculation. European powers watched eagerly, positioning armies and forging alliances in preparation for the inevitable war that would follow his death. The War of the Spanish Succession was not simply a political struggle, but the tragic climax of decades of genetic folly. The Habsburg experiment had ended in extinction, a dynasty that had once commanded half the world now represented by a broken man, unable to lead or reproduce. His death would trigger upheaval and conflict, reshaping the balance of power in Europe for generations. The final years of Charles II's life were marked by profound despair. He remained confined to his chambers, increasingly unable to communicate or care for himself. His physical deterioration was shocking even to those accustomed to his condition. The king's jaws were malformed, making eating painful and dangerous. He choked frequently, requiring constant supervision. His speech was almost unintelligible, limited to gestures and expressions. He sometimes experienced hallucinations, speaking to ghosts and dead relatives. The loneliness was palpable. His wife was distant, his mother's health failing from the stress and sorrow. The once mighty monarch was reduced to a tragic figure, a symbol of a doomed dynasty. Despite his suffering, Charles was not forgotten. His courtiers and ministers worked tirelessly to maintain appearances and uphold the semblance of royal authority. But behind the polished facades and ornate ceremonies, the kingdom was unraveling. Economic decline accelerated, corruption spread, and military defeats undermined Spain's position on the world stage. The empire's colonies grew restless, sensing the weakening grip of the crown. The political landscape became a delicate dance of intrigue, with ministers and foreign powers jockeying for influence as they awaited the inevitable succession crisis. The psychological toll on Charles was immense. He lived in fear of betrayal and assassination, convinced enemies lurked within the palace walls. His paranoia grew, and he scrutinized his servants and advisors with suspicion. This fragile monarch, trapped by his genetic fate and the expectations of his birth, spent his days in a haze of confusion and fear. His few moments of lucidity were overshadowed by fits of despair and withdrawal. The king who once embodied the hopes of a great empire was now a tragic symbol of its decline. When Charles II died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 34, it marked the end of an era. The Spanish Habsburg line was extinguished, and with it, the hope of a revival for an empire that had ruled the seas and continents. His death unleashed a political firestorm that plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would shape the continent's future for decades. The lessons of his life, the dangers of obsession with bloodline purity, the human cost of dynastic ambition, echo through history as a solemn warning. The autopsy revealed the tragic extent of the genetic disaster. Physicians noted malformed organs, a brain smaller than normal, and reproductive organs incapable of producing heirs. The physical evidence of decades of inbreeding lay exposed, a silent testimony to the folly of a dynasty that placed lineage above health. The Spanish people mourned their king but also recognized the end of suffering. The empire he left behind was fractured, weakened, and on the brink of profound change. Charles II's legacy was not one of triumph, but of a warning whispered across centuries about the cost of playing God with blood and power. In the wake of Charles II's death, the fragile peace that held Europe together shattered like thin glass. The Spanish Empire, once a titan of global influence, now stood exposed and vulnerable, its fate hanging precariously in the balance. The question of succession, which had loomed quietly over the dying king's final years, erupted into a full-blown crisis that would consume the continent for more than a decade. With no heir to claim the throne, the Spanish crown became the prize of rival powers, each eager to extend their own reach and reshape Europe's political landscape. This struggle, known to history as the War of the Spanish Succession, was not merely a contest of armies and treaties. It was a battle for the soul of an empire and the legacy of a dynasty. Before the war's outbreak, the European courts were gripped by a tense uncertainty. The death of Charles II left a vacuum that no one could fill easily. The Habsburgs of Austria, distant cousins and traditional rivals of the Spanish branch, staked their claim to the throne. They argued that the vast Spanish territories rightfully belonged to them as the closest blood relatives. Meanwhile, the Bourbon family of France, under the rule of Louis XIV, pressed their own claim through a will left by Charles II, which had named Philip of Anjou, Louis's grandson, as successor. This French claim terrified many European powers, who feared a union of France and Spain under one monarch would upset the balance of power and threaten their own sovereignty. The alliances that formed in response to this looming threat became the blueprint for the war to come. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, fearing the rise of a Franco-Spanish superpower, coalesced in a grand coalition to oppose the Bourbon claim. Diplomatic maneuvering filled the courts, with envoys and spies weaving webs of intrigue and alliances. Secret meetings and public declarations marked the early years after Charles's death, as each power tried to secure its position and influence in the new order. The war, when it finally erupted in 1701, would stretch across Europe and into colonial territories overseas, becoming one of the most widespread and destructive conflicts of its time. But while monarchs and generals played their deadly game, the Spanish people found themselves caught in the crossfire of history. The death of their king was not just a political event but a profound moment of loss and uncertainty. For many, the once great empire was already fading into a shadow, and Charles II's passing seemed to confirm that decline. In towns and villages, rumors spread of what the future might bring. Stories of battles fought far away reached ears that had little understanding of the complex politics, but keenly felt the economic hardships tightening around them. Trade slowed, taxes increased, and the familiar rhythms of daily life grew harder to maintain. Within Spain's borders, the absence of a strong monarchy revealed the fragility of the government. Regional nobles and provincial governors began to assert more autonomy, often acting as rulers in their own right rather than loyal servants of the crown. This fragmentation further weakened the central authority, as local interests frequently clashed and cooperation became difficult. In the cities, merchants and craftsmen struggled against economic stagnation. Colonial revenues, once the lifeblood of Spain's wealth, dwindled as overseas territories grew restless or slipped into the hands of rival powers. The empire's global reach, once unchallenged, was now under siege on multiple fronts. The war itself was brutal and unforgiving. Battles raged across the plains of Spain, the fields of Italy, and the forests of Central Europe. Armies composed of soldiers from many nations fought with ferocity and desperation. The conflict was not limited to the battlefield. Sieges devastated towns, crops were burned, and civilians suffered the horrors of war. Refugees fled the violence, seeking safety wherever they could find it. The economic toll was enormous, draining resources and diverting attention from governance and reform. As armies clashed, the hopes of restoring Spain's former glory dimmed with each passing year. Amid this turmoil, the Spanish royal court moved to the new capital at San Ildefonso, away from the turmoil of Madrid and the war-torn regions. Here, the remnants of the monarchy and its advisors clung to the hope of restoring order. Yet the court was a shadow of its former self, full of intrigues, rivalries, and uncertainty. The new king, Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV, ruled not only Spain but also brought French influence deeply into the Spanish government. His reign was marked by efforts to centralize power, reform administration, and revitalize the military. But his foreign origins and the war itself made these tasks extraordinarily difficult. One of the most profound effects of the war was the cultural shift it triggered within Spain. The confidence and dominance of the Habsburg era gave way to a more cautious, sometimes fearful society. The arts and literature reflected this change. Writers explored themes of loss, identity, and the passage of time, while painters captured the somber realities of war and decline. The golden age of Spanish culture faded into a period of reflection and melancholy, as the nation grappled with its diminished status. Yet even in hardship, there were moments of resilience and creativity that hinted at renewal and adaptation. The war's conclusion in 1714 brought a tenuous peace but left Spain fundamentally changed. The Treaty of Utrecht redrew maps and realigned powers. Spain lost territories, including the Spanish Netherlands, parts of Italy, and Gibraltar to the British. The Bourbon dynasty was firmly established on the Spanish throne, but at a cost that included diminished influence and fractured identity. Internally, Spain faced the challenge of rebuilding a fractured empire, addressing economic woes, and healing social divisions. The legacy of the Habsburg genetic tragedy was now eclipsed by the political realities of Bourbon rule and the new European order. Beyond politics and war, the human stories of this era reveal the complexities of life in a changing Spain. Peasants, merchants, soldiers, and nobles all experienced the consequences of empire's decline in different ways. For many ordinary people, survival became a daily struggle amid shifting allegiances and economic uncertainty. Social unrest simmered in some regions, fueled by poverty and dissatisfaction with central authorities. At the same time, new ideas about governance, economy, and society began to circulate, setting the stage for future reforms and transformations that would slowly reshape Spain in the centuries to come. The memory of Charles II lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in palace corridors and public squares alike. His life embodied the tragic consequences of blind ambition and the relentless pursuit of power at the expense of humanity. Yet, his story also prompted reflection and change. The genetic isolation practiced by European nobility began to be questioned, slowly giving way to more diverse alliances and marriages. The hard lessons of his reign influenced medical thought, political strategy, and cultural expression, shaping a more cautious and pragmatic Europe. In the broader sweep of history, the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs and the War of the Spanish Succession marked a turning point. The age of vast empires ruled by hereditary monarchs gave way to a more complex world of shifting alliances, emerging nation-states, and new economic powers. Spain's decline was part of this global transformation, a reminder of the fragility of empires built on unstable foundations. The political, social, and cultural ripples of this era continued to shape Europe and the Americas for generations. Even as the decades passed, the shadows of the past remained visible in Spain's landscape and memory. Palaces, battlefields, and archives preserved the traces of a once mighty dynasty and the dramatic struggles that ended it. Historians, artists, and writers would revisit the era repeatedly, seeking to understand the forces that shaped it. The lessons drawn from the fall of Charles II and the ensuing war serve as enduring reminders of the complex interplay between genetics, power, and human destiny. This chapter of history teaches us that monarchy and empire are not just about crowns and armies, but about the fragile human lives intertwined with their fates. Charles II's tragic existence, the wars that followed his death, and the reshaping of Europe reveal a world where ambition and limitation, glory and decay, hope and despair coexist. In this tension lies the profound drama of history, one that continues to captivate, caution, and inspire. The death of Charles II marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a profound transformation for Spain, a transformation that unfolded slowly, painfully, and with profound consequences. The years that followed revealed a kingdom struggling to redefine itself amidst the ashes of its former glory, caught between old traditions and the urgent demands of a changing world. To understand Spain's journey through this turbulent time, we must look beyond the battles and treaties, and listen instead to the voices of those who lived through the upheaval: the nobles, the peasants, the soldiers, and the thinkers who saw the cracks widening beneath the empire's surface. Spain's economy, once the envy of Europe, faced unprecedented challenges. The wealth that had poured in from the Americas began to dwindle, disrupted by war, piracy, and shifting trade routes. Silver mines in Mexico and Peru still produced, but much of that treasure found new paths to rival powers. Inside Spain, merchants grappled with inflation, inconsistent policies, and the burdens of taxation that fell heavily on the lower classes. The countryside suffered from neglect, as agricultural productivity declined and rural populations faced hardship. Famine and poverty became harsh realities for many, eroding the social fabric that had once been held together by the monarchy's strength. The military, too, bore the scars of decline. Once feared across continents, the Spanish armies were riddled with inefficiency, low morale, and outdated tactics. Officers, often drawn from noble families, found themselves torn between loyalty to their homeland and personal ambitions. Battles fought during the War of the Spanish Succession exposed deep weaknesses, and the loss of strategic territories highlighted Spain's diminishing influence. Efforts at reform were met with resistance, as entrenched interests and corruption slowed progress. The country's ability to defend itself and project power waned, leaving its colonies vulnerable and its borders exposed. Socially, the post-Habsburg period was marked by tension and uncertainty. The rigid class structures of the past began to show signs of strain. The nobility, though still powerful, faced challenges from rising merchant classes and enlightened thinkers who questioned inherited privilege. Peasants and urban workers, bearing the brunt of economic difficulties, grew restless. Episodes of unrest and rebellion flared in various regions, from Catalonia to Andalusia, signaling a growing awareness of the disparities and injustices that plagued society. At the same time, the Catholic Church, which had long been intertwined with the monarchy's authority, sought to maintain its influence amid the shifting political landscape. Amid this complexity, Spain's cultural life experienced both continuity and change. The grandeur of the Golden Age faded, but a new generation of writers, philosophers, and artists grappled with questions of identity, faith, and the future. The works of figures like Benito Geronimo Feijó and Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos began to challenge superstition and promote education and reform. Baroque art and architecture persisted, with their dramatic intensity reflecting the era's contradictions: beauty mingled with decay, faith entwined with doubt. Music and theater continued to flourish, offering both escapism and commentary on the times. Politically, the Bourbon monarchy sought to consolidate power and modernize governance. Philip V introduced reforms inspired by French absolutism, aiming to strengthen the central government and streamline administration. These efforts included reorganizing provincial governments, revising tax systems, and attempting to curtail the privileges of the nobility and clergy. Resistance was fierce, and progress uneven, as traditional power holders fought to protect their influence. Yet the seeds of change were sown, planting the roots for Spain's eventual emergence into the modern era. Internationally, Spain's position remained precarious. The loss of territories in Europe and the Americas diminished its global stature. Rival powers like Britain and France expanded their colonial empires and naval strength, increasingly dominating trade routes and influence. Spain's struggles to maintain control over remaining colonies foreshadowed the upheavals that would come in the 19th century. Yet, even in decline, Spain retained cultural and spiritual significance, with its Catholic heritage and artistic legacy continuing to resonate. The shadow of Charles II's genetic legacy lingered as a cautionary tale within the royal family and beyond. Medical knowledge was still primitive, but the consequences of centuries of intermarriage were becoming undeniable. This awareness gradually influenced marriage alliances and dynastic strategies, pushing European royal houses toward broader connections and away from the dangers of close kinship. The story of the last Habsburg kings served as a somber reminder of the costs of ambition unchecked by reason and humanity. For ordinary Spaniards, the post-Habsburg era was a time of adaptation and endurance. Families adjusted to new rulers, shifting economies, and changing social norms. Some found opportunity amid the changes, while others struggled to hold on to traditions and livelihoods. Oral histories, folk songs, and local customs preserved memories of the old empire even as new realities took hold. The tension between past pride and present challenges created a complex national identity that would continue to evolve. Religious life remained a central pillar, though it too faced challenges. The Inquisition persisted, enforcing orthodoxy and moral order, but Enlightenment ideas slowly permeated intellectual circles. Debates over faith, reason, and governance stirred in universities and salons. The Church's role in education and social services continued, even as some clergy embraced reformist ideas. These tensions mirrored broader European currents, where tradition and progress often collided. Education reform became a critical focus for Spain's future. Visionaries like Feijó advocated for scientific inquiry and critical thinking, hoping to break the cycle of ignorance and superstition that hindered progress. Schools and academies aimed to cultivate a new generation equipped to lead Spain out of decline. Yet access to education remained limited, and resistance from conservative factions slowed implementation. Still, the movement signaled hope for renewal and the potential for transformation rooted in knowledge. The arts reflected and shaped Spain's complex emotions during this period. Painters like Francisco Goya emerged, capturing both the grandeur and the darkness of the times. Goya's work, with its vivid portrayals of war, suffering, and social critique, spoke to a nation grappling with its identity. Literature similarly explored themes of loss, power, and human frailty. This cultural flowering amidst adversity highlighted Spain's resilience and its ongoing dialogue with history. Spain's colonial possessions experienced parallel challenges. Across the Atlantic, New Spain and other territories faced threats from rival European powers and internal unrest. Economic exploitation and social hierarchies shaped colonial societies, while indigenous populations navigated survival under foreign rule. The decline of Spain's central authority had profound effects on governance and local dynamics, setting the stage for future independence movements. The legacy of the War of the Spanish Succession and the end of the Habsburg line echoed beyond Europe. The shifting balance of power influenced alliances and conflicts worldwide. Colonial rivalries intensified, trade expanded, and ideas circulated with greater speed. Spain's diminished role contrasted with the rise of Britain and France as dominant imperial powers. The global consequences of this era underscored the interconnectedness of politics, economics, and culture. Within Spain itself, memories of the Habsburgs mingled with hopes for the Bourbon future. The new dynasty sought legitimacy through patronage, reform, and symbolic gestures. Ceremonies, architecture, and public works aimed to inspire unity and pride. Yet the wounds of the past remained visible in politics, society, and collective consciousness. Reconciling these contradictions was a slow and difficult process. The personal stories of those who lived through these times reveal the human dimension of historical change. Letters, diaries, and official records offer glimpses into hopes, fears, and everyday struggles. From noble courts to rural villages, people navigated upheaval with varying degrees of agency and resilience. Their experiences enrich our understanding of history as lived reality, not just abstract events. Philosophical and political ideas also evolved. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, liberty, and progress began to influence Spanish thinkers and reformers. These ideas challenged absolute monarchy and traditional hierarchies, planting seeds for future revolutions. Yet, the path to modernity was fraught with tension, resistance, and complexity unique to Spain's history and culture. The role of women during this period, often overlooked, deserves attention. While constrained by social norms and legal limitations, women contributed to cultural, economic, and social life in significant ways. Some engaged in intellectual salons, others managed households and estates amid upheaval. Their voices, though often muted, provide important perspectives on the era's challenges and transformations. As the 18th century progressed, Spain faced continued efforts at reform under successive Bourbon monarchs. These included attempts to modernize the economy, centralize authority, and improve education and infrastructure. The success of these efforts varied, often hampered by entrenched interests and limited resources. Nonetheless, they reflected a recognition of the need to adapt and evolve in a changing world. The shadow cast by Charles II and the Habsburg genetic legacy persisted as a cautionary element in Spanish and European royal consciousness. The awareness of biological and political vulnerability influenced decisions and strategies for generations. This legacy underscored the delicate balance between power and humanity, ambition and consequence. Finally, Spain's journey through the post-Habsburg era is a story of endurance and transformation. It reveals a nation grappling with loss and renewal, tradition and change. The complexities of this period shaped the Spain that would emerge in later centuries, still proud of its heritage, yet aware of the challenges that come with history's relentless flow. In understanding this chapter, we gain insight not only into Spain's past but also into the universal human experience of navigating change amid uncertainty. The death of Charles II did not just leave a vacant throne, it opened a fissure in the very foundations of European politics that would erupt into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would last for over a decade and redraw the map of Europe. At the heart of this war lay the question: who would inherit Spain and its vast empire? This was not merely a matter of royal succession, but a question that would shape the balance of power between the continent's greatest dynasties, influencing diplomacy, war, and alliances for years to come. Charles II died without an heir, and his failing health had been a cause of anxiety for decades. His physical and mental incapacities meant he could not produce an heir to continue the Habsburg line. His death in 1700 was thus both expected and catastrophic, a long-feared moment that sent shockwaves across Europe. The Spanish Empire, sprawling across continents, was a prize coveted by many, especially the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austrian Habsburgs, who both laid claim to the throne. The French claimant was Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, whose mother was Charles II's sister. The Austrians put forward Archduke Charles, a Habsburg who argued that Spain's crown should revert to the main Habsburg line after Charles II's death. This dynastic rivalry became a spark that ignited a broader struggle involving most of Europe, dragging kingdoms into a complex web of alliances and enmities. The war itself was brutal and sprawling. Battles raged not only in Spain but across Europe, from the plains of Italy to the coasts of the Netherlands. Armies clashed with devastating consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. The conflict drained treasuries, disrupted trade, and caused widespread suffering. Spain, once a formidable empire, found itself a battleground for foreign powers more than a sovereign nation defending its own interests. Spain's internal divisions only worsened the situation. Various regions, such as Catalonia and Valencia, took different sides, some supporting the Austrian claimant, while others favored the Bourbon candidate. These fractures highlighted the challenges of governing a diverse empire, where local loyalties and identities complicated the larger political picture. The war deepened resentments and left scars that lasted for generations. The economic impact was severe. War expenses ballooned, and Spain's already weakened economy was pushed to the brink. The loss of territories in Europe and the Americas further reduced revenues, while trade suffered under naval blockades and piracy. The common people bore the brunt of this strain, facing higher taxes, food shortages, and the horrors of wartime violence. Urban centers and rural communities alike struggled to survive in these harsh conditions. Diplomatically, the war reshaped alliances. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire formed a coalition against the Franco-Spanish Bourbons, fearing the prospect of a powerful union between France and Spain that could dominate Europe. These alliances were fluid and fraught with shifting interests, betrayals, and negotiations that underscored the precariousness of the balance of power. The war's end came with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, a series of agreements that brought both peace and profound change. Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, was recognized as King of Spain, but with the crucial condition that the French and Spanish crowns remained separate. Spain ceded territories such as the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Gibraltar to other powers. These territorial losses marked a decisive shift in Europe's geopolitical landscape. For Spain, the treaty signaled the beginning of Bourbon rule, a new dynasty that aimed to modernize the nation and restore its strength. Philip V's reign introduced reforms inspired by French absolutism, centralizing authority and attempting to streamline governance. These changes faced resistance from entrenched interests, but represented an effort to adapt Spain to the realities of the 18th century. Culturally, the Bourbon era ushered in new influences. French language, customs, and art found their way into Spanish courts, mingling with traditional Spanish heritage. This fusion created a unique cultural environment that reflected Spain's evolving identity. Yet, nostalgia for the Habsburg past lingered, with many mourning the loss of a dynasty that had shaped Spain for centuries. The war and its aftermath also affected Spain's colonies. The loss of European territories was balanced somewhat by the retention of vast overseas possessions, but colonial governance became more centralized under Bourbon reforms. Efforts to improve administration and increase revenues often led to tensions with colonial elites and indigenous populations, sowing seeds of future unrest. The Spanish people, meanwhile, lived through a period of uncertainty and adaptation. The war's devastation, combined with economic hardship, challenged their resilience. Yet, communities found ways to endure, through local traditions, religious festivals, and social networks that provided support and meaning. The legacy of the war was not only political but deeply human. The memory of Charles II and the Habsburg decline continued to shape Spanish consciousness. His tragic life remained a cautionary tale about the dangers of dynastic obsession and the limits of royal power. His story became part of a broader reflection on Spain's place in the world and the costs of empire. Philosophers and intellectuals of the time debated the lessons of the war and the nature of monarchy. Enlightenment ideas, advocating reason, progress, and constitutional government, gained ground among some segments of society. These ideas challenged traditional authority and planted the seeds for future political transformations. Religious institutions maintained significant influence but were not immune to change. The Church sought to support the monarchy and maintain social order, even as some clergy engaged with reformist ideas. The tensions between tradition and innovation echoed in religious, cultural, and political spheres. Women's roles during and after the war also warrant attention. While often excluded from formal power, women in noble and common families influenced social networks, managed estates, and sometimes played roles in diplomacy and patronage. Their experiences add depth to our understanding of this era's complexities. The war's impact on art and literature was profound. Painters like Goya, though born later, drew on the themes of conflict and suffering that marked this period. Writers explored questions of loyalty, identity, and change, capturing the emotional landscape of a nation in transition. Education reform continued under Bourbon rule, with efforts to promote science, secular learning, and critical thinking. These initiatives aimed to equip Spain for the challenges of a new age but faced obstacles in deeply traditional societies. Military reforms sought to rebuild Spain's forces, learning lessons from the war's failures. Modernization efforts focused on training, discipline, and technology but struggled against financial constraints and institutional inertia. Spain's relationship with other European powers evolved, balancing cooperation and rivalry. The Treaty of Utrecht marked a new era of diplomacy, with Spain seeking to assert its interests amid shifting alliances. Colonial policy became more strategic, with increased emphasis on control and exploitation, but also on defense against competing empires. These dynamics would shape the Americas for decades. Finally, the War of the Spanish Succession and its aftermath symbolize a pivotal moment in Spain's long history, a moment of crisis that forced the nation to confront its vulnerabilities and begin the difficult process of renewal. The legacy of this era resonates in Spain's culture, politics, and identity to this day. The Bourbon dynasty's arrival in Spain brought with it hope for renewal but also challenges that tested the resilience of a nation weary from war and decline. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, inherited a fractured realm battered by conflict and economic hardship. His reign marked a decisive break from the Habsburg past, yet the shadows of that era lingered, haunting his court and the hearts of his subjects. Philip's reforms aimed to centralize royal authority, reducing the power of regional nobility and streamlining governance. The old kingdoms of Spain, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, and others, had long enjoyed varying degrees of autonomy, but under Bourbon rule, the crown sought uniformity and control. This process, known as the Nueva Planta decrees, abolished many regional privileges and institutions, igniting resentment and resistance, especially in Catalonia and Valencia. The reforms extended beyond politics. The Bourbon monarchs imported French culture, language, and court etiquette, reshaping Spain's social and cultural landscape. French became the language of diplomacy and high society, and French art and architecture influenced Spanish tastes. Yet, this cultural shift was met with mixed feelings. Some embraced the cosmopolitan influences, while others mourned the loss of distinctly Spanish traditions. Economically, Philip V faced a monumental task. Spain's treasury was depleted from decades of war, its industries weakened, and its colonies threatened by rival empires. Efforts to revitalize trade, agriculture, and manufacturing met obstacles, from outdated practices to entrenched interests wary of change. The crown promoted mercantilist policies, seeking to protect Spanish goods and expand colonial revenues, but progress was slow and uneven. The war's devastation had left deep scars on the Spanish people. Rural areas struggled with poverty, while cities grappled with overcrowding and disease. Famine and hardship were common, and social unrest simmered beneath the surface. The government's attempts to impose taxes and reforms sometimes sparked protests, reflecting a society grappling with the demands of modernization amid persistent inequality. Religious life remained central to Spanish identity, yet the Church's role evolved under Bourbon rule. While the Crown supported the Catholic Church as a pillar of authority, it also sought to curtail the influence of religious orders and increase state oversight. The Inquisition continued its work, but its power gradually waned in the face of Enlightenment ideas and royal policies promoting greater secular control. Education reform was another pillar of Bourbon modernization. New schools and academies opened, emphasizing science, mathematics, and secular subjects alongside traditional religious instruction. The Crown hoped to cultivate a more enlightened citizenry capable of contributing to Spain's recovery and progress. However, access to education remained limited, and conservative factions resisted changes they saw as threats to faith and order. The arts flourished in this era of renewal. Painters like Juan Carreño de Miranda and later Francisco Goya captured the complexities of Spanish life, from royal portraits and religious scenes to vivid depictions of social realities. Literature, too, reflected the tensions of the age, exploring themes of identity, power, and change. Patronage from the crown and nobility helped sustain cultural vibrancy despite economic challenges. Spain's military, once a dominant force, underwent significant reforms aimed at rebuilding strength and discipline. New training methods, fortifications, and strategies were introduced, learning from the failures of previous conflicts. Yet funding remained a persistent problem, and the army's effectiveness fluctuated in response to political and financial pressures. Colonial administration also shifted. The Bourbons sought tighter control over Spain's vast overseas territories, implementing bureaucratic reforms and increasing royal oversight. The viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, along with other colonies, experienced changes designed to enhance revenue extraction and improve defense against European rivals. These policies sometimes ignited tensions with colonial elites and indigenous peoples, laying groundwork for future upheavals. Diplomatically, Spain recalibrated its position. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the country aimed to regain influence while avoiding entanglement in costly European wars. Alliances shifted as Spain sought to balance relations with France, Britain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Treaty of Utrecht's conditions shaped Spanish foreign policy, limiting territorial ambitions but preserving core holdings. The Bourbon kings faced internal challenges beyond politics and economics. Court intrigues, rival factions, and competing interests complicated governance. Philip V's bouts of illness and eventual abdication in favor of his son Louis I briefly interrupted reforms, though Philip soon resumed the throne. These personal and political dramas underscored the fragile nature of royal authority in a turbulent age. Socially, the period saw gradual changes. The rise of a merchant class and growing urbanization altered traditional hierarchies. Yet, rigid class structures and deeply ingrained privileges limited social mobility. Peasants and workers continued to face hardships, and the gulf between rich and poor remained vast. The crown's efforts to modernize often bypassed the needs of the lower classes. Women's roles during this time were complex and often contradictory. While legal and social constraints persisted, noblewomen exercised influence through patronage, family networks, and sometimes political intrigue. In the colonies, indigenous and mestiza women navigated intersecting layers of identity and oppression. Their stories reveal a nuanced picture of gender and power in Bourbon Spain. Religious festivals, local customs, and popular culture flourished alongside official reforms, providing continuity amid change. These traditions sustained community bonds and offered solace in difficult times. The tension between old customs and new policies reflected the broader struggles of a society in transition. Scientific inquiry and intellectual life advanced under Bourbon patronage. Institutions like the Royal Academy of Sciences fostered research and debate, while Enlightenment thinkers introduced new ideas challenging established beliefs. This intellectual ferment would have profound effects on Spain's future, influencing reforms and revolutionary movements. Despite these advances, resistance to change was strong. Conservative forces within the church, nobility, and rural communities pushed back against reforms they saw as threats to their privileges and traditions. This dynamic created ongoing conflict between innovation and preservation, shaping the trajectory of Spanish history. The arts, sciences, and politics intertwined in this vibrant but conflicted era. Court painters captured both the grandeur and fragility of Bourbon rule, while writers grappled with the contradictions of an empire seeking renewal yet haunted by its past. These cultural expressions offer a window into the complexities of 18th-century Spain. The Bourbon reforms set Spain on a new path, but the legacy of war, economic decline, and social division posed ongoing challenges. The nation's future depended on balancing modernization with tradition, central authority with regional identities, and imperial ambitions with domestic stability. This era laid the groundwork for Spain's gradual transformation from a declining empire to a modern state. The consequences of decisions made during Philip V's reign echoed across centuries, influencing the course of Spanish and European history. As Spain navigated these turbulent waters, its people endured hardship and change, adapting to new realities while holding on to deeply rooted identities. Their resilience shaped the nation's character, even as it faced profound uncertainties. In the shadows of palaces and amidst the bustle of markets, the story of Bourbon Spain unfolded, a story of power and struggle, hope and loss, continuity and transformation. It is a story that reveals much about the human condition, caught between the weight of history and the possibilities of the future. The reign of Charles III, often called Spain's enlightened despot, marked a remarkable chapter in Bourbon Spain's journey toward modernization. Ascending the throne in 1759, Charles III was determined to strengthen the kingdom, improve the lives of his subjects, and restore Spain's standing among European powers. His vision blended royal authority with Enlightenment ideals, a difficult balancing act that defined his legacy. Charles III's reforms reached into every corner of Spanish life. He pursued administrative centralization, continuing efforts to reduce regional autonomy established under Philip V, but he tempered these with pragmatic governance that sought to accommodate local customs when feasible. His policies aimed to create a more efficient, unified state capable of competing on the European stage. Economically, Charles III launched initiatives to stimulate agriculture, industry, and commerce. He encouraged the cultivation of new crops, improved irrigation systems, and supported the establishment of manufactories producing textiles, ceramics, and other goods. By promoting internal trade and reducing tariffs within Spain's territories, he sought to break down barriers that had long hindered economic growth. In the cities, urban planning and public works blossomed under his reign. Madrid, the capital, transformed with the construction of wide boulevards, parks, and monumental buildings. The king commissioned architects and engineers to design infrastructure that would symbolize Spain's renewal and impress visitors from abroad. These projects created jobs and fostered civic pride. Education reforms were central to Charles III's agenda. He expanded schools, founded the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and promoted scientific research. Believing knowledge was key to progress, he supported Enlightenment thinkers and sought to reduce the Church's monopoly on education. Still, tensions remained as clerical authorities resisted efforts perceived to undermine their influence. Religious life under Charles III was marked by cautious reform. While the Catholic Church remained dominant, the king sought to limit the power of certain religious orders and curtail the Inquisition's reach. He encouraged the secularization of some institutions, believing the state should have greater control over social affairs. These measures provoked opposition from conservative factions but reflected a broader European trend. Foreign policy under Charles III was ambitious yet pragmatic. Spain allied with France in conflicts such as the 7 Years' War and later the American Revolutionary War, aiming to regain lost territories and check British power. Although victories were mixed, Spain's involvement underscored its continued relevance in global affairs. The American colonies became a focal point of Spain's imperial strategy. Charles III sought to strengthen colonial administration and defense, wary of growing unrest and foreign threats. Reforms aimed to improve governance and extract revenues, but also planted seeds of discontent among colonial elites and indigenous peoples, foreshadowing future upheavals. Culturally, the reign of Charles III was vibrant. Art, music, and literature flourished under royal patronage, blending traditional Spanish styles with Enlightenment influences. Public theaters, museums, and botanical gardens opened, reflecting a spirit of curiosity and refinement. Yet, these cultural advances coexisted with persistent social inequalities. The social fabric of Spain remained complex. Nobility retained privileges, but the rising bourgeoisie gained influence through commerce and education. Peasants and urban workers continued to face hardships, and rural poverty remained widespread. Efforts to improve public health and welfare began, but systemic change was slow. Women's lives during Charles III's reign reflected broader societal norms. While formal education for women was limited, some noblewomen became patrons of the arts and intellectual salons. In cities and colonies, women navigated social constraints with resilience, maintaining families and communities amid shifting political landscapes. Scientific inquiry advanced under royal support. Spanish scholars contributed to fields like botany, astronomy, and medicine. The king founded institutions to encourage experimentation and knowledge dissemination. These efforts connected Spain to the wider European Enlightenment, fostering dialogue and innovation. Despite reforms, resistance persisted. clergy and traditional elites challenged changes threatening their power, while regional identities complicated centralization efforts. The monarchy balanced reform with repression, navigating a delicate path through competing interests. Charles III's reign also witnessed significant challenges. Natural disasters, such as earthquakes and floods, tested the kingdom's resources and governance. Epidemics periodically swept through cities, exposing weaknesses in public health systems and exacerbating social tensions. The arts captured the era's contradictions. Painters portrayed regal splendor alongside scenes of everyday hardship. Writers explored themes of progress and tradition, freedom and constraint. These cultural products offer insight into a society grappling with transformation. Military reforms continued, aiming to modernize Spain's forces and improve readiness. The navy was a particular focus, critical for protecting colonial interests and trade routes. However, budget limitations and corruption undermined full effectiveness. Trade policies reflected Spain's struggle to balance protectionism and expansion. Efforts to open new markets and foster economic growth met resistance from entrenched interests wary of change. The crown negotiated treaties to secure advantages, but rival powers remained formidable obstacles. Colonial unrest simmered beneath the surface. Indigenous uprisings and dissatisfaction among Creole elites signaled the fragility of Spain's overseas empire. Reforms sought to tighten control but often exacerbated grievances, setting the stage for future revolutions. The Enlightenment's influence permeated Spanish intellectual life. Philosophers, scientists, and writers debated ideas about governance, rights, and society. These discussions influenced policy but also inspired critics of monarchy and church alike. Despite the progress, Spain remained a deeply hierarchical society. Legal privileges, social customs, and economic disparities constrained opportunities for many. Reformers recognized these limitations but faced powerful opposition. The personal life of Charles III reflected his complex reign. Known for his pragmatic and somewhat austere demeanor, he maintained strict control over court affairs. His family life was marked by duty and decorum, embodying the ideals of enlightened monarchy. As his reign drew to a close, Charles III left a legacy of cautious but significant reform. His policy set Spain on a path toward modernization, even as unresolved tensions foreshadowed future conflicts. His vision balanced innovation with respect for tradition, seeking to strengthen the kingdom in an age of change. The story of Charles III's Spain is one of ambition and contradiction, progress and limitation. It reveals the challenges of governing a diverse and historic nation facing the demands of a new era. The echoes of his reign resonate in Spain's continuing journey toward identity and modernity. The death of Charles III in 1788 marked the end of an era, and the beginning of new challenges for Spain. His successor, Charles IV, inherited a kingdom poised between hope and uncertainty. Unlike his father's confident reforms, Charles IV's reign would be shaped by indecision, turmoil, and the rising storm of revolution sweeping through Europe. Charles IV lacked his father's political acumen and vision. Often seen as a passive ruler, he was heavily influenced by his wife, Queen Maria Luisa, and the controversial favorite Manuel Godoy. Godoy, rising from obscurity to become prime minister, wielded immense power, guiding Spain through a volatile period marked by shifting alliances and internal unrest. Europe in the late 18th century was a continent in upheaval. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, sent shockwaves across borders and thrones. Monarchies trembled as republican ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity challenged the old order. Spain, sharing a long border with France, found itself at the center of these seismic shifts. At first, Charles IV and Godoy sought to contain the revolutionary contagion. Spain joined coalitions against France, fighting alongside other monarchies to restore the Ancien regime. These wars strained Spain's finances and military, exposing weaknesses in the kingdom's infrastructure and leadership. Domestically, the Spanish population faced growing hardships. Economic difficulties worsened as war disrupted trade and agricultural production. Food shortages and rising prices fueled discontent among peasants and urban workers. The once vibrant spirit of Enlightenment reform gave way to fears of disorder and repression. Godoy's influence became increasingly unpopular. Seen by many as a symbol of corruption and incompetence, he was blamed for military defeats and diplomatic failures. His lavish lifestyle and close ties to the royal family alienated nobles and commoners alike, deepening divisions at court and beyond. Amid these tensions, Spain's colonial empire showed signs of strain. Inspired by revolutionary ideals and resentful of imperial control, Creole elites and indigenous peoples in the Americas began to agitate for greater autonomy. Rebellions and conspiracies emerged, challenging the crown's authority far from Madrid. The Napoleonic Wars further complicated Spain's fate. Initially, Spain allied with France under the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1796, hoping to regain lost territories and counter British naval dominance. But the alliance proved unstable, as French ambitions clashed with Spanish interests. In 1807, Napoleon's armies entered Spain under the pretext of invading Portugal, an ally of Britain. What followed was a betrayal that shook the nation to its core. Napoleon forced Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand VII, only to then depose both and place his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. This ignited the Peninsular War, a brutal and protracted conflict that would become one of the defining struggles of early 19th century Europe. Spanish resistance took many forms: guerrilla warfare by peasants, formal battles by royalist armies, and widespread popular uprisings fueled by nationalism and anger at foreign occupation. The war devastated Spain. Towns and countryside alike suffered destruction, famine, and displacement. The conflict exposed the fragility of Spain's institutions and the deep wounds left by years of neglect and misrule. Yet, amid the chaos, a fierce spirit of resilience and patriotism emerged. Spanish society fractured but also united against a common enemy. Clergy, nobility, peasants, and intellectuals found new roles in the struggle for independence. The Catholic Church, despite earlier tensions with the monarchy, became a rallying force for resistance, framing the fight as a holy cause against invaders. Women played vital roles during the war. Many managed estates, supplied troops, or served as spies and messengers. Their courage and sacrifice challenged traditional gender roles and left lasting impressions on the fabric of Spanish life. The war also accelerated political change. In 1812, amid the conflict, Spanish liberals drafted the Constitution of Cádiz, one of Europe's earliest attempts at constitutional monarchy and representative government. Though limited in scope and contested by conservatives, it planted seeds for future democratic movements. Internationally, the Peninsular War drained French resources and tied down Napoleon's forces, contributing to his eventual downfall. Britain's involvement, led by the Duke of Wellington, was crucial in supporting Spanish guerrillas and restoring the monarchy. The restoration of Ferdinand VII in 1814 brought hope for stability but also disappointment. Rejecting the Constitution of Cádiz, Ferdinand reinstated absolutist rule, suppressing liberals and dissenters. His reign was marked by repression, exile, and political turmoil, setting the stage for decades of conflict. The loss of much of Spain's American empire followed in the wake of independence movements inspired by revolution and weakened imperial control. Countries from Argentina to Mexico broke free, forever altering Spain's global role and economy. Spain's internal divisions deepened between conservatives seeking to preserve traditional authority and liberals pushing for reform and modernization. These conflicts sparked civil wars, known as the Carlist Wars, throughout the 19th century, tearing communities apart. Despite the turmoil, Spain gradually embarked on modernization efforts. Railways, industry, and infrastructure expanded, and education reforms slowly spread. Intellectuals debated the nation's identity and future, grappling with the legacy of empire, monarchy, and revolution. The era also witnessed cultural flourishing. Romanticism inspired writers, artists, and musicians who reflected the passions and struggles of their time. Folklore, regional traditions, and national pride blended in works that sought to define what it meant to be Spanish. As the 19th century progressed, Spain faced the challenge of reconciling its past with the demands of a new age. The story of Charles IV and the Peninsular War remains a powerful chapter in this journey, a testament to resilience, tragedy, and transformation. This period reminds us that history is rarely neat or predictable. It is a tapestry woven from conflicting desires, ambitions, and fears. And it is in the spaces between certainty and chaos that the true spirit of a nation is forged. The aftermath of the Peninsular War left Spain scarred and exhausted. The nation's wounds ran deep, physical, political, and psychological. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and the social fabric torn apart. Yet, from the ashes of devastation, new ideas began to take root, signaling a slow but inexorable shift in Spanish society. The return of Ferdinand VII to absolute power was a bitter disappointment for many who had hoped the war would bring reform. His rejection of the Constitution of Cádiz and the repression of liberals fueled resentment and unrest. Political factions hardened into bitter enemies, setting the stage for decades of instability. Liberal ideals continued to simmer beneath the surface, championed by intellectuals, students, and urban middle classes eager for change. Secret societies and underground movements formed, advocating constitutionalism, freedom of the press, and the rule of law. The clash between tradition and progress became a defining tension. Meanwhile, the conservative forces, including the church and landed aristocracy, sought to preserve the old order. They viewed the revolutionaries as dangerous radicals threatening Spain's unity and Catholic identity. Their influence was strong in rural areas, where loyalty to monarchy and church remained deep-rooted. Spain's colonies, inspired by the revolutionary fervor and weakened imperial control, accelerated their pushes for independence. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led liberation movements that would eventually dismantle the vast Spanish-American Empire. The loss of these territories was a profound blow to Spain's prestige and economy. The struggles between liberals and conservatives erupted into open conflict during the Carlist Wars, a series of brutal civil wars fought over succession disputes and the future of the monarchy. The Carlists, supporters of traditional monarchy and Catholic values, clashed with the liberals who favored constitutional monarchy or republicanism. These wars tore families apart and ravaged the countryside. Villages were caught in the crossfire, and guerrilla warfare became common once again. The violence and political chaos left lasting scars on the Spanish psyche, deepening divisions that would last well into the 20th century. Despite the turmoil, Spain slowly began to modernize. Railroads spread across the country, linking once isolated regions and fostering commerce. Factories appeared in cities, drawing workers and accelerating urbanization. New ideas in science, education, and governance found footholds, though progress was uneven. Cultural life flourished amid the contradictions of change and tradition. The Romantic movement inspired poets like Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer and painters such as Francisco Goya, whose haunting works captured both the beauty and tragedy of the age. Literature and art wrestled with Spain's identity in a rapidly changing world. Education reforms sought to expand literacy and knowledge beyond the elite, though resistance from conservative factions limited their reach. Universities became centers of debate and dissent, producing generations eager to shape Spain's destiny differently from their ancestors. The Church, while losing some political clout, remained a powerful force in daily life. It controlled vast lands and institutions, influencing social norms and education. Yet, anti-clerical sentiments grew among liberals, who blamed the Church for impeding progress and supporting reactionary policies. Women's roles during this period began to shift subtly. While still largely confined by traditional expectations, some women engaged in literary circles, philanthropy, and even political activism. These early efforts laid groundwork for the feminist movements that would emerge later. Economic challenges persisted. Spain lagged behind other European powers in industrialization and infrastructure development. Agricultural inefficiencies and unequal land distribution hampered growth. Poverty and inequality fueled social unrest, particularly in rural areas. The working class, concentrated in burgeoning industrial cities, organized strikes and protests demanding better wages, hours, and conditions. Socialist and anarchist ideas found fertile ground among laborers, sparking confrontations with authorities and employers. Spain's foreign relations reflected its diminished status. The loss of empire relegated the country to a secondary role in European affairs. However, Spain remained a key player in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, balancing between alliances and neutrality amid great power rivalries. Throughout the 19th century, the monarchy struggled to maintain relevance. Successive kings faced revolutions, coups, and exile. The question of Spain's governance, monarchy, republic, or dictatorship, remained unsettled, reflecting the country's deep divisions. Yet, in moments of crisis, the Spanish people demonstrated resilience. Popular uprisings, such as the Revolution of 1868, overthrew monarchs and demanded reform. The brief First Spanish Republic attempted to redefine the nation, though internal conflicts undermined its stability. The restoration of the monarchy in 1874 brought a fragile peace but failed to resolve underlying tensions. Political parties alternated power through managed elections, often ignoring the voices of marginalized groups. Corruption and clientelism plagued the system. Throughout these upheavals, Spain's cultural and intellectual life continued to evolve. Writers like Benito Pérez Galdós depicted social realities with unflinching detail. Philosophers and scientists contributed to broader European conversations, striving to modernize Spain's thought. The 19th century closed with Spain still wrestling with its identity and place in the world. The legacy of Charles IV's troubled reign, the Peninsular War, and the struggles for modernization remained deeply felt. Spain's journey was one of painful transformation, marked by loss, resistance, and hope. This chapter of history teaches us that nations are shaped not only by kings and battles but by the countless lives caught between them. It is a story of endurance, of people striving for dignity and change amid forces beyond their control. As we move forward, remember this: history is alive in the echoes of revolution and reform. It whispers in the ruins of palaces and in the songs of workers. It lives in the courage of those who dared to dream of a better Spain. They had always called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But now, as Charles moved into his 30s, the whispers that once danced behind tapestries grew bolder, closer, darker. He was no longer a boy of fragile limbs and dazed stares. He was a man racked with chronic illness, plagued by seizures, trembling from weakness, his speech slurred, his hearing half lost, and his body curving inwards like a burned candle. The court physicians, as helpless as they were proud, poked and probed with an ever-growing list of remedies that failed him. They bled him weekly, they blistered him monthly, they purged him with vile concoctions meant to rebalance humors that had never been balanced to begin with. They whispered about his black bile, his overabundant phlegm, his lack of seed, his oversized head, anything but the truth, that his very bloodline had betrayed him long before his first breath. The palace chapel became not just a place of worship but of desperation. Saints were brought in their holy form, relics paraded past his bedside, the bones of martyrs set before his cloudy eyes. Candles burned night and day in supplication to heaven, while the air inside the palace grew heavier with incense and sorrow. Pilgrimages were made in his name to holy shrines across Spain. Monks in rough woolen robes knelt in caves, praying for the deliverance of a king whose soul they feared might never rise from his body. Even his mother, Mariana, steeped as she was in piety and superstition, ordered exorcisms. She allowed holy men to chant over Charles as he lay sick in bed, while sacred oils were rubbed into his chest. They were trying not to cure an illness. They were trying to cast out demons, to purge whatever spirit had possessed his body. It wasn't just his health they feared. It was what he represented, the failing light of a once mighty house. In portraits from this era, you see Charles draped in heavy robes, with Habsburg eyes turned slightly downcast. There is an air of pageantry to it all: velvet, lace, gold-threaded sashes, but his eyes betrayed the illusion. There is no authority behind them, no imperial spark, only a deep and constant fatigue. His body, though clothed in the trappings of power, told the truth. He struggled to walk without assistance. He struggled to chew without pain. At times, he forgot entire days. When he tried to govern, his orders often contradicted each other. Ministers quietly rewrote them. Spain was not ruled by Charles. It was ruled in his name, by others, in hallways behind closed doors. The court was a cage, and its courtiers circling vultures. Factions had emerged long ago, but now they were bold in their maneuvering. Some were loyal to Mariana, who still attempted to shield her son and steer the regency even after his coming of age. Others courted the influence of foreign ambassadors, placing subtle bets on what might happen if Charles were to die without issue. France, Austria, and England all had agents in Madrid, and they watched Charles's health like hawks. At every downturn, fever, fainting, fever again, they sent coded reports home. They weren't waiting for war. They were preparing for it. Charles's moments of lucidity grew rarer, but sometimes there were glimmers, brief hours in which he asked sincere questions about his realm. He wanted to understand why grain shipments had failed, why the silver from the Americas no longer arrived in reliable quantities, why the treasury always seemed empty. He wanted to help. But by the time the explanations reached him, they had already passed through layers of censors and flatterers. His reign was a theater stage for a dying king. The real decisions were made elsewhere, by his mother, by his council, by foreign diplomats shaping the future of Spain with every passing month. Spain itself was rotting from within. The economy had become increasingly hollow. The aristocracy clung to wealth that no longer existed, living in borrowed grandeur while peasants starved during failed harvests. The church taxed and tithed with relentless devotion, even as churches themselves emptied of worshippers. Banditry was on the rise. Roads were unsafe outside major cities. Entire provinces felt like abandoned children of a mother who no longer cared. And all the while, Charles's portrait still adorned town halls, his name still spoken in prayers. But few believed anymore. Not in him. Not in the crown. His physicians had grown desperate. They prescribed elixirs made of ground pearls and deer horn. They applied leeches to his back and temples. They fed him broths of exotic birds, claiming the vitality would pass from animal to man. Nothing helped. And so the ritual returned, prayers, saints, sacred chants. More holy bones were brought into the palace, finger joints of apostles, cloths stained with the blood of unnamed martyrs. It was less medicine than spectacle. The people wanted a miracle. The court wanted stability. And Charles, lying in a darkened chamber, wanted peace. The Queen, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was equally trapped. Her marriage to Charles had been celebrated as a union of France and Spain, a great hope for future heirs. But years had passed, and there were no children. She cried herself to sleep often, confiding in her ladies-in-waiting that she felt cursed. The pressure to produce an heir was unbearable, and rumors circulated that she had used witchcraft, poisons, or worse to avoid conception. It was not fair. She had done nothing wrong. But a barren queen was an easy scapegoat in a superstitious court. Her French lineage made her suspect. Her charm and grace made her envied. She came to love Charles, not as a wife might love a husband, but as one might love a wounded creature. She pitied him. She cared for him in his illnesses. She read to him when he could no longer focus. And she endured the judgment of courtiers who believed every failure of the royal couple was her fault. Once, she confessed to a visiting bishop that she dreamed not of bearing heirs, but of returning to France, to green gardens and sane people. Spain, she said, was a country haunted by ghosts, and she felt like one of them. As Charles's body declined, so too did his spirit. He spoke less. He moved only when necessary. His face, always pale, took on a yellowish hue. His teeth fell out. He could no longer chew properly and drank most of his meals. He soiled himself in bed. His servants wept in private. But they continued dressing him each morning in the heavy trappings of monarchy, the stiff collar, the embroidered doublet, the velvet cloak. It was theater. The last act of a long, tragic play. Spain had had many kings, warriors, reformers, visionaries. But now, it had a saint in waiting, a monarch who suffered nobly, publicly, endlessly. One winter evening, during a thunderstorm that shook the palace walls, Charles reportedly awoke in a panic. He claimed he had seen the Virgin Mary in a dream, weeping. He demanded that every saint in the royal chapel be placed in his chamber overnight. Relics were rushed in. Prayers were recited. But the storm continued, and Charles trembled under his covers like a frightened child. That night, his fever surged. He survived, but something changed. From then on, he rarely left his chamber. In Madrid, the people lit candles in the streets, hoping for divine intercession. But privately, they began preparing for the end. Across Europe, diplomats whispered of succession, partition, war. The fate of an empire, vast, fragile, exhausted, rested on a dying man who could barely hold a spoon. And in the flickering candlelight of his chamber, with saints lining the walls, Charles prayed too. Not for victory, not for legacy. Just for quiet. Just for rest. The halls of the Alcazar had grown quieter now, as if the very stones understood the sorrow that loomed beneath their arches. Courtiers walked with softer steps. Servants whispered in corners. Even the wind that once swept through the palace balconies seemed hesitant, as though it too mourned what was becoming of Spain. Charles was aging, though his body had never known health. His bones, brittle and aching, now carried more than just a dying man, they carried a dying world. The court physicians had long given up on promising miracles. They had tried everything: leeches, poultices, ground pearls, blessed oils from Rome. Yet the king's body remained a battlefield where the enemies were time, blood, and birth. The candles at his bedside burned low each night as his eyes wandered toward a heaven he could barely comprehend. He still prayed, of course. Devotion had been carved into him like a groove in a dying tree, but now even his prayers seemed quieter, like letters left unopened on an altar. Across the empire, Spain trembled with uncertainty. The colonies groaned under the weight of distance and rebellion. The silver that once flooded in from the New World was no longer enough to mask the rot in the treasury. Ships returned with less. Merchants complained. Hunger gnawed at villages that once danced in festivals. Charles's subjects, once fiercely proud of their empire, had begun to speak in careful tones, of fears, of futures, of what might come when the Habsburg candle finally flickered out. And flicker it did. Charles's court had become a stage of waiting. Every ambassador watched the king's health like a man watching storm clouds before harvest. France had already begun to posture, preparing to move should the Spanish line fail. The Austrian Habsburg sent inquiries masked as concern. Italy grew restless. The Netherlands, once Spain's pride, bristled with the memory of lost freedom and the promise of a shift. The empire that had once ruled with gold and faith now ruled with borrowed time. In the dimly lit room where Charles spent most of his final years, tapestries hung faded and heavy with dust. A once vibrant court painter had captured the king again and again over the years, each portrait showing the subtle erosion of body and spirit. The last painting never left the artist's studio. It was said the painter wept as he mixed the colors: ashen skin, hollow cheeks, eyes that did not know peace. Charles had not posed for it. He had only been watched from a distance, and painted like one might paint a memory about to vanish. The Queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, still held her vigil. She had grown paler too, less out of grief and more out of calculation. She had her own ambitions, her own network of influence, her own reasons to keep the king breathing for just a little longer. She watched him with eyes that measured time like a clockmaker, and behind her smile, there lay the fear of a regency lost, a crown passed to another house, perhaps even a war she could not stop. Spain's nobility were split down hidden lines. Some favored the French Bourbon claim, young, ambitious, tied to a future of power. Others clung to the Austrian side, tradition, faith, the preservation of Habsburg legacy. But in the middle sat Charles, unaware or uncaring, unable to choose even if he wished to. His council debated endlessly. Names passed between lips like coins: Philip of Anjou, Archduke Charles of Austria, others more distant. But none of them were him. None carried the curse, the name, the blood that had built an empire and doomed it too. Charles had no child, no heir. His marriage had borne nothing, and his line would end with him. In a monarchy built on lineage, this was a silent catastrophe. To the outside world, Spain still appeared strong. But inside, it was a fading portrait, regal in frame, but eaten away by moths of war, decay, and silence. In the churches, candles were lit for the king's health, but even the priests whispered more for the soul than the body. Confessions increased. So did omens. A strange illness in the south. A poor harvest in the north. A comet seen above Toledo. Superstition returned like an old guest, welcomed back by fear. People remembered the Inquisition, the plagues, the famines. Memories that had been buried were now unearthed, as if the dying king's breath exhaled the past back into the world. Charles himself, it seemed, began to retreat. He spoke less, ate less, even in his rituals. He no longer touched his relics with reverence. His fingers trembled as he reached for the crucifix. When he slept, he often dreamed aloud, calling out to his dead mother, to saints whose names no one recognized, to a child he had never fathered. Each passing week brought another decline. His hair thinned and whitened. His skin sagged. His mind wandered. And all the while, the world moved around him with careful cruelty. Advisors met in secret. Treaties were drawn behind velvet curtains. In Versailles, Louis XIV made plans that would shape Europe for a century. In Vienna, the emperor weighed maps and bloodlines. In England, Parliament debated the succession like gamblers betting on a storm. And in Madrid, the king grew smaller and smaller, shrinking into the folds of his own robe, until he seemed more ghost than monarch. The people of Spain, for all their pride, had begun to look away. They did not want to see their king like this. They remembered the days of Charles V, of Philip II, when Spain ruled the oceans and cast long shadows across the world. What they had now was a dying boy in a dying man's clothes. Yet even in decline, Charles remained a symbol. A tragic one, yes, but a symbol all the same. His life, so warped by history, so twisted by bloodlines and duty, had come to represent not just the fall of a man, but the fall of a world. His face, with its jutting jaw and hollow eyes, had been etched into coins, statues, church mosaics. His body may have betrayed him, but his image had ruled generations. And now that image faded too. In private moments, he stared into mirrors as if searching for someone else. Not a king. Not a man. Just someone who had never asked to be born into this. In one such moment, a servant once found him weeping softly, not from pain, but from something deeper. A sorrow so profound it had no words, no reason. Just a kind of mourning for a self that never got to live freely. Outside, as autumn fell over Madrid, the leaves curled and dropped like whispers. The city took on a kind of stillness, as if all held their breath. Soldiers stood guard at gates with solemn faces. Priests walked more often through the streets. Windows were shuttered earlier. Bells rang more slowly. And within the palace, in a bed too large for such a fragile figure, Charles lay still, listening not to voices, but to the sound of an empire sighing its last. His breath, shallow and uncertain, matched the heartbeat of a nation unsure of what would come next. And above his head, the great canopy carved with Habsburg emblems swayed gently, like a crown slowly tipping from the head of a child who had carried it too long. The death of Charles II was no sudden thunderclap. It had been a storm gathering for years, a dark horizon looming over Spain and Europe alike. As his body weakened, so did the fragile peace that had held the continent together. In the shadows of royal courts, behind closed doors heavy with velvet and intrigue, alliances were forged and broken with the same cold precision as sword strikes on the battlefield. Spain's neighbors, once wary allies, now became eager predators circling a wounded beast. The throne was empty even before the king took his last breath, and the question was not if war would come, but when. Every kingdom had a stake in the coming chaos. France, led by the ambitious Louis XIV, saw an opportunity to extend its power beyond borders. His claim through his grandson Philip of Anjou was a spark meant to ignite the flames of Bourbon expansion. Across the Alps, the Austrian Habsburgs, guardians of the old empire, refused to yield their rights easily. Their candidate, Archduke Charles, embodied centuries of imperial tradition and the hope for continuity. England, the Netherlands, and other powers each saw a chance to rebalance the scales of power, to carve new pieces from the old Spanish dominion. Diplomats scurried across Europe, carrying messages that whispered promises, threats, and veiled warnings. Within Spain, the uncertainty cracked open old wounds. The nobility, long accustomed to loyalty born from fear and faith, now jockeyed for position. Regional governors fortified their cities and arms were stockpiled quietly in taverns and town squares. The once unshakable monarchy was reduced to a puppet show, strings pulled by men who cared more for their estates than the fate of the realm. The common people, meanwhile, watched from shadows, sensing that the world they knew was shifting beneath their feet. Farmers prayed for peace, merchants feared ruin, children played unaware of the war that would shape their futures. Charles's funeral was a spectacle of sorrow and strategy. The palace was draped in black velvet, banners lowered, and candles flickered in a chapel heavy with incense. Yet beneath the mournful music and solemn prayers, the eyes of Europe watched, calculating and cold. The king's coffin, adorned with the insignia of a lost dynasty, was a symbol both of an end and a beginning. His death was mourned by few but observed by many. In that moment, Spain was both a kingdom in mourning and a prize waiting to be won. The War of the Spanish Succession, as it would come to be called, was not just a clash of armies but a collision of hopes, fears, and ambitions. Armies marched across battlefields where the echoes of old conquests seemed distant memories. Fire met fire, and blood-stained lands once ruled by the silver-tongued diplomacy of monarchs who now lay silent in tombs. Cities burned, alliances shifted like quicksand, and millions would pay the price for the legacy of one fragile man's life. Yet through it all, the question lingered: what had been sacrificed for a crown that could not be worn with pride? Even as cannons roared and diplomats quarreled, the story of Charles II remained a haunting reminder. He was the ghost in every negotiation, the shadow behind every sword. His life was a testament to the dangers of obsession with bloodlines and power over people. The empire he inherited was vast, but its foundations were brittle, built on decades of neglect, fear, and flawed decisions. The war that followed was both a reckoning and a rewrite, a brutal correction to centuries of ambition. And so, as the world plunged into conflict, Spain began to fade from the center of power it had once commanded. Its ships sailed fewer seas, its gold flowed less freely, and its influence waned like the dying light of a candle struggling against a growing night. The empire that Charles had inherited, that his ancestors had fought to build, was breaking apart in ways no king could stop. The memory of the last Habsburg monarch became a symbol of loss, a cautionary tale whispered in courts and taverns alike. Yet beneath the rubble of history and the smoke of war, life endured. Children were born, stories were told, and new rulers rose to take their place. The world would move on, as it always does, carrying the echoes of the past like ghosts in its shadow. But the legacy of Charles II, of a king burdened by fate and blood, would linger long after the last cannon had fallen silent. The War of the Spanish Succession was a vast, tangled conflict involving not just armies but the very hopes and fears of entire peoples. As soldiers marched across Europe, they carried with them more than muskets and bayonets. They carried the weight of dynastic dreams and the future of empires. The war's battles were fought on multiple fronts, land and sea, mountains and plains, each with its own fierce struggles and tragic stories. In the northern provinces of Spain, the war raged with particular ferocity. The Catalan cities, fiercely loyal to the Habsburg cause, became battlegrounds where neighbor fought neighbor, and loyalties were torn between survival and allegiance. Streets ran thick with mud and blood as sieges turned peaceful towns into fortresses. Families hid in cellars, praying for the sound of gunfire to cease, hoping against hope for a glimpse of peace. Children grew up surrounded by the drums of war, their innocence stolen by the relentless march of soldiers and the cold eyes of commanders. The French armies, bolstered by seasoned veterans, pushed deep into Spanish territory, capturing key fortresses and cities. Their presence brought devastation but also a strange mixture of order amid chaos. Supply lines stretched thin, and the harsh winters of the Pyrenees tested the limits of both men and beasts. Horses starved in the cold, cannons froze, and men suffered from frostbite as much as from enemy fire. Yet, despite the hardships, the French forces maintained a brutal discipline, motivated by loyalty to their young prince and the grand vision of a united Bourbon Spain. On the other side, the Anglo-Dutch alliance brought a different kind of strength. Their naval supremacy ensured that French forces could not easily resupply by sea, cutting off crucial lifelines and starving the enemy into submission. The fleets battled fiercely in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, their sailors risking death not only from enemy cannonballs but also from treacherous storms. The sea became a war zone, with ships burning and sinking beneath the waves, each loss echoing in the harbors of London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon. Yet the war was not fought only by armies and navies. Behind the scenes, spies and diplomats wove a web of intrigue and deception. Letters intercepted, secret meetings in shadowed halls, and whispered conversations in palace corridors shaped the course of the conflict as much as any battle. Alliances shifted like sand, and betrayals were common. A single misplaced word could mean the fall of a fortress or the collapse of a fragile treaty. Every player in the game was acutely aware that the stakes were nothing less than the future of Europe. For the common people, the war brought suffering beyond measure. Harvests failed as fields were trampled by marching troops. Trade was disrupted, causing shortages of food and essential goods. Tax collectors came with increasing harshness, demanding money to fund the endless fighting. Peasants were conscripted into armies far from home, many never to return. Women were left to care for shattered homes, struggling against hunger and disease. The plague, always lurking, found new victims among the displaced and the destitute. The cultural impact of the war was profound. Artists and writers, living through the turmoil, captured the mood of despair and uncertainty. Paintings depicted ruined landscapes and weary soldiers, while poetry and prose lamented the destruction of families and kingdoms. Yet amid the darkness, glimmers of hope appeared. Some saw the war as a crucible, forging new identities and alliances that might one day bring lasting peace. The idea of a Europe united by common laws and diplomacy took root, even as battles raged on. In the halls of power, the old order struggled to survive. Monarchs and nobles clung to traditions that were fraying under the pressure of modern warfare and shifting political realities. The costly war exposed weaknesses in armies, governments, and economies alike. Some rulers began to see that the future demanded change, a rethinking of alliances, governance, and even the nature of kingship. The legacy of Charles II's broken reign lingered as a cautionary tale of what happens when power becomes isolated from the needs of the people. The war's end was both a relief and a beginning. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, redrew borders and ceded territories, aiming to create a balance that would prevent future conflicts. Spain lost some of its European holdings, and the Bourbon dynasty was recognized on the throne, but the empire was forever changed. The treaty marked the rise of Britain as a global power and the gradual decline of Spanish dominance. It was a new chapter in European history, born of sacrifice and sorrow. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, cities destroyed, and economies shattered. The social fabric of many nations was torn, with families broken and communities displaced. The memories of war shaped generations, influencing politics, culture, and collective consciousness for decades. The human cost was the price paid for a dynastic gamble gone terribly wrong. In the end, the War of the Spanish Succession was a reflection of the fragile nature of power itself. It showed how the fate of a continent could hinge on the health and heirs of a single man. Charles II's life and death were not just personal tragedies but events with consequences that rippled across the world. His story reminds us that behind the grand narratives of history lie real lives, fragile and finite, shaped by forces beyond their control. As Europe slowly rebuilt, the lessons of the war were etched into its future. Diplomacy gained new importance, alliances became more carefully managed, and the horrors of prolonged conflict spurred efforts to avoid similar devastations. The era of absolute monarchies began to wane, making way for more modern forms of governance. The shadow of Charles II and the war he left behind remained a haunting reminder of the dangers of isolation and the costs of ambition. And so, as the cannons fell silent and the banners were folded away, Europe entered a new age, one marked by uncertainty but also possibility. The old empires had crumbled, but from their ruins grew the seeds of a future yet to be written. The War of the Spanish Succession was over, but its story would echo through the centuries, a testament to the enduring struggle for power, survival, and hope. The death of Charles II did not simply mark the end of a man's life, it marked the end of an entire epoch. His passing closed the chapter on the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a lineage that had for centuries held sway over vast territories and shaped the destiny of Europe. But the empire Charles left behind was a shadow of its former glory, fractured, vulnerable, and struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Spain was a nation gripped by uncertainty. The succession crisis had ignited a brutal conflict, but the real challenge lay in rebuilding a kingdom torn apart by years of neglect and war. The infrastructure was crumbling, the treasury was drained, and the people were weary. Cities that had once bustled with wealth and power now bore scars of siege and famine. Rural communities suffered from depopulation as men had been conscripted or fled the chaos, leaving behind fields untended and homes abandoned. Yet amid this bleak landscape, efforts to restore Spain's standing began. The new Bourbon king, Philip V, arrived with a determination to reform and revitalize. Influenced by French ideas of centralized power and enlightened governance, he sought to modernize the administration, reduce the power of unruly nobles, and rebuild the military. This marked a turning point, the transition from the sprawling, often chaotic Habsburg Empire to a more streamlined, Bourbon-controlled Spain. But reforms were not easy. Resistance came from many quarters. The old nobility, who had long enjoyed privileges and local autonomy, bristled at royal attempts to curtail their influence. Regional identities, particularly in Catalonia and Aragon, clashed with the Bourbon vision of a unified Spain. Rebellions and unrest flared as different groups wrestled with what it meant to be Spanish in this new era. Economically, the empire faced monumental challenges. The once vast colonial riches were drying up as trade routes shifted and rivals gained ground. The silver mines of the Americas, which had filled Spain's coffers for centuries, produced diminishing returns. Smuggling and corruption further sapped wealth from the royal treasury. Efforts to stimulate industry and agriculture struggled against entrenched systems and outdated methods. For many Spaniards, life remained a daily struggle against poverty and hardship. Socially, the legacy of the Habsburgs' genetic tragedy lingered in the collective memory. The cautionary tale of Charles II became part of the nation's identity, a symbol of decline brought on by isolation and mismanagement. The aristocracy began to open its ranks slightly, marrying outside of the traditional circles to bring new blood and ideas. The sciences and medicine, once stagnant under superstitions, slowly gained ground as new thinkers challenged old dogmas. Culturally, the post-Charles II era was complex. Spain had been a beacon of Renaissance art and literature in earlier centuries, but the troubles of the 17th century dimmed its creative flame. Yet, even in decline, Spain produced works that reflected the tumultuous times. Writers grappled with themes of loss, identity, and transformation, while painters captured the somber realities of a nation in transition. The arts became a mirror, reflecting both the pride and pain of a changing Spain. Internationally, Spain's diminished role reshaped the balance of power. Where once it had been a dominant empire, it now contended with rising nations such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands. The Treaty of Utrecht had not only ended the War of the Spanish Succession but also redrawn the map of European influence. Spain ceded territories in Italy, the Low Countries, and the Americas, signaling a retreat from global dominance. Its fleets, once feared across oceans, were increasingly outmatched by British naval power. Yet despite these losses, Spain remained a proud nation. Its identity was deeply rooted in history, religion, and culture. The Catholic Church retained significant influence, guiding not only faith but also politics and education. Festivals, traditions, and regional customs flourished, offering continuity amidst upheaval. For many Spaniards, the nation was more than its political power. It was a living tapestry of language, faith, and community. The lessons of Charles II's reign and death rippled beyond Spain's borders. Across Europe, royal families reconsidered their marriage strategies, slowly moving away from the dangerous practice of close kin unions. Enlightenment ideas, emphasizing reason and scientific understanding, began to challenge old assumptions about heredity and governance. The horrors of the Habsburg genetic legacy serve as a grim warning about the costs of isolation and the fragility of dynastic power. Meanwhile, Spain's colonies faced their own trials. The Americas, Asia, and Africa were distant realms where imperial control was often tenuous. The weakening of Spanish authority encouraged rebellions and the rise of local elites. Indigenous populations, enslaved peoples, and settlers all navigated shifting power dynamics. The colonial economies, once the engine of Spain's wealth, had to adapt to changing markets and competition. These far-flung lands were both a burden and a lifeline for a struggling empire. The story of Spain after Charles II is one of resilience amid decline. It is a tale of a nation forced to confront its limits, to reckon with the mistakes of the past, and to chart a new course in a world that had moved beyond the dynastic ambitions of old. The transition was painful and fraught with setbacks, but it also laid the groundwork for Spain's eventual revival and modernization in centuries to come. As the shadows of the Habsburg dynasty faded, the Spanish people looked toward a future uncertain but full of potential. They inherited not only the burdens of history but also the enduring spirit of a culture that had endured invasions, plagues, and upheavals. Spain's journey after Charles II was far from over. It was a story of reinvention, survival, and the ongoing quest for identity and purpose. In the quiet corners of Madrid's palaces, in the bustling markets of Seville and Barcelona, and in the vast plantations of the Americas, the legacy of Charles II's reign was remembered not as a simple end but as a beginning. A beginning shaped by loss, yes, but also by the unyielding human desire to move forward, to rebuild, and to find hope even in the darkest times. The death of Charles II unleashed a storm that had been quietly gathering for decades. The War of the Spanish Succession was not simply a battle for a throne, it was a confrontation of empires, ambitions, and alliances that would reshape the map of Europe and the wider world. The war was the inevitable outcome of a fragile balance, the explosion of years of political maneuvering, dynastic claims, and shifting loyalties. At the heart of the conflict lay the question: who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire? Charles II had died childless, the last of a line devastated by genetic tragedy and political isolation. But his throne was the prize for which the great powers of Europe were prepared to wage war. On one side stood the Bourbons, represented by Philip of Anjou, the grandson of France's Louis XIV. On the other, the Habsburgs of Austria, who claimed their right through closer blood ties and long-standing family alliances. The stakes were enormous. Control of Spain's territories meant dominion over a global empire stretching from Europe to the Americas, from Italy to the Philippines. As tensions rose, Europe's diplomatic landscape transformed into a complex chessboard of alliances. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire formed the Grand Alliance to oppose the Bourbon claim, fearing the union of France and Spain under a single dynasty would upset the continent's fragile balance of power. These alliances were not static. Loyalties shifted with the tides of war, with some states negotiating separate peace treaties while others fought fiercely on. The war's brutality was unmatched. Battles raged across multiple fronts, from the fields of northern Italy and the Pyrenees to the coasts of the Low Countries and the distant colonies overseas. Commanders like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy emerged as military legends, their campaigns marked by both strategic brilliance and devastating carnage. Cities were besieged, armies marched for months under harsh conditions, and civilians suffered the harsh realities of war, famine, displacement, and destruction. But this was no mere military struggle. The conflict was also ideological and cultural. Propaganda flooded the European courts and newspapers, painting the enemy as tyrants, heretics, or threats to civilization. Religion played a subtle yet persistent role, with Catholic and Protestant powers vying for influence in contested territories. The war thus became a crucible in which the fate of monarchies, religions, and emerging nation-states intertwined. The Spanish people themselves bore the brunt of the turmoil. The once mighty empire was being torn apart by battles fought on its soil and across its oceans. Colonial governors struggled to maintain order as the metropole's attention was consumed by the conflict. Trade routes were disrupted, and piracy flourished as naval powers vied for supremacy. The economic toll was immense. Harvests failed, taxes soared, and poverty spread. Amidst the chaos, the question of legitimacy lingered like a shadow. Philip V, though installed on the throne, faced resistance not only from foreign powers but also from factions within Spain. Some regions, especially Catalonia and Valencia, sided with the Habsburg claimant, leading to internal strife that deepened the nation's wounds. The war was as much a civil conflict as it was an international one, with communities divided in loyalty and hopes. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713 and 1714, eventually brought an uneasy peace. It recognized Philip V as King of Spain but imposed significant territorial losses to the Bourbons. Spain ceded the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia to Austria, Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain, and parts of its American empire to other powers. The treaty redrew the geopolitical map and established a new balance of power designed to prevent any one nation from dominating Europe again. Yet peace was fragile. The wounds of war left scars on the continent that would influence future conflicts and diplomacy for decades. The balance of power concept, so crucial in European politics, was both cemented and contested in this period. The War of the Spanish Succession was a brutal reminder of how intertwined dynastic ambition and national interest could become, and how the fate of millions could hinge on the health and heirs of a single monarch. In the years following the war, Spain faced the monumental task of recovery and redefinition. The empire's loss of territory was a blow, but it also marked the beginning of a shift in focus, from sprawling dominions to internal reform and modernization. Philip V and his successors sought to strengthen royal authority and rebuild a nation fractured by decades of instability. They implemented reforms inspired by French absolutism and Enlightenment ideas, aiming to revive Spain's fortunes through centralized governance, economic development, and military renewal. The war also heralded changes beyond Spain's borders. Britain emerged as a dominant naval power, gaining strategic footholds that would serve its imperial ambitions for centuries. The Dutch Republic, though victorious, faced decline as a major player, while Austria expanded its influence in Italy and Central Europe. France, though checked, remained a formidable force, but the balance of power was now a central principle guiding European diplomacy. For the Spanish people, the legacy of the war was complex. It was a time of loss, upheaval, and sacrifice, but also of resilience and hope. Communities rebuilt, cultures adapted, and identities evolved. The empire's future would be shaped not just by kings and treaties, but by the enduring spirit of its people who endured hardship and sought renewal. The War of the Spanish Succession was more than a historical event, it was a turning point. It marked the end of an era dominated by dynastic struggles and the beginning of modern European statecraft. It taught lessons about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the costs of empire, and the fragile nature of power. And above all, it reminded the world that behind every treaty and throne lay the lives of countless individuals caught in the tides of history. The death of Charles II of Spain did not just mark the end of a monarch's life, it marked the extinction of a dynasty, the collapse of an empire, and the closing of a chapter in European history that had begun with grandeur and ended in tragedy. The Spanish Habsburg line, once the most powerful royal family on the continent, had been consumed by generations of inbreeding, ambition, and political isolation. Their story was a stark lesson in the dangers of obsession with bloodline purity, a cautionary tale that would echo through history. Charles II's life was defined by suffering, from the moment of his birth, marked by deformity and frailty, to his final days of isolation and despair. The Habsburg lip, his shrunken jaw, and his countless illnesses were the physical manifestations of a family's reckless pursuit of genetic perfection. but behind the physical symptoms was a man trapped in a web of expectations he could never fulfill. His inability to produce an heir fractured the very foundation of European power. The War of the Spanish Succession, which followed his death, was the violent aftermath of this failure. It tore apart alliances, reshaped borders, and cost the lives of hundreds of thousands. Europe's great powers battled not just for territory, but for the very future of monarchy and empire. The peace treaties that finally ended the conflict imposed severe losses on Spain, signaling a shift in the balance of power and the beginning of Spain's decline as a dominant global force. Yet, the story of the Habsburgs was not just one of decline. Their reign had been an age of cultural richness, exploration, and complex politics. The Spanish Empire had been a melting pot of peoples, languages, and religions, bound by a shared history of conquest and colonization. The arts flourished under royal patronage, from the somber paintings of Velázquez to the haunting music of the Baroque. Even in decay, the empire's cultural legacy endured. The extinction of the Habsburg line also forced Europe to reconsider the nature of monarchy itself. The extreme inbreeding practices, once seen as necessary to preserve royal blood, became a warning sign. Other royal families began to open their marriage policies, seeking alliances beyond narrow family circles. The tragedy of Charles II influenced the slow emergence of more modern ideas about governance, heredity, and the responsibilities of rulers. For Spain, the aftermath was a period of painful transformation. The loss of vast territories in Europe and the Americas forced the crown to look inward. Reforms aimed at centralizing power, modernizing the administration, and revitalizing the economy were introduced. Though the empire was diminished, these changes laid the groundwork for future resilience, even as Spain struggled to regain its former glory. The human cost of this era was immense and often overlooked. The king's suffering had been mirrored by countless individuals across the empire, nobles, peasants, soldiers, and colonists, whose lives were shaped by the tides of power and politics. Families were torn apart, communities uprooted, and cultures changed forever. The legacy of Charles II's reign was as much about these hidden stories as it was about treaties and thrones. In the quiet halls of the Alcazar of Madrid, where Charles II was born and died, silence now reigned. The echoes of a dynasty's rise and fall lingered in the shadows, a reminder of the fragile nature of power and the price of hubris. The genetic experiment that had begun with hope had ended in heartbreak, leaving behind a kingdom in mourning and a continent forever changed. Yet history, with all its cruelty and chaos, also holds lessons of resilience and renewal. Spain would endure, its people rebuilding, reimagining, and moving forward. The story of the last Habsburg kings serves as a somber reflection on the complexities of human ambition and the unintended consequences of choices made in pursuit of power. As we look back on this turbulent chapter, we see not just the fall of a dynasty, but the rise of new ideas and new orders. The age of dynastic wars was giving way to the era of nations and modern diplomacy. The scars of the past shaped the world that followed, a world striving to balance tradition with change, strength with compassion, and legacy with hope. Charles II's final breath closed the door on an empire that had once ruled half the world. But his story, tragic and poignant, continues to remind us that history is not merely about kings and queens, but about the fragile, often fragile, threads that bind humanity across generations. And so, in the fading light of a long and sorrowful reign, we find a lesson that transcends time, that the pursuit of perfection at the cost of humanity can only end in loss, and that the true strength of a people lies not in their bloodlines, but in their resilience, their stories, and their enduring spirit. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. A story not just about markets and ropes, but about silence. About what happens when society looks away. Wife selling may be gone, but the way it was accepted, ignored, and later forgotten, still echoes. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. These quiet corners of history matter, and I'm glad we could explore this one together. I'd love to know what time it is where you are, and where you're listening from. Leave a comment below, I read everyone. And if you'd like more stories like this, soft, strange, and grounded in forgotten truth, consider subscribing. For now, close your eyes, let the past drift, and rest well.